Mexican cartels don't just practice torture, they perfect it. For them, cruelty is calculated, a method designed to push victims beyond their breaking point, from unleashing tigers to chili pepper in wounds, and even turning something as innocent as a vase of flowers into a weapon of pain. Cartels have mastered the art of suffering, but just how far will they go? On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're exposing the cartel tortures so extreme, they are worse than death. Number 10. We'll start off on easy mode, which for cartels is still brutal. Fear. When they're not busy mutilating their victims, they're driving them mad with more abstract forms of cruelty and terror. A lot of the time, this involves making them think their loved ones are about to die horrific deaths. Sure, killing rivals is an easy way to establish dominance, but fear is a stronger tool. Shoot a rival, that's one less dealer. Tie a rival to a chair, film his torture and post it on TikTok with a Post Malone soundtrack? Everyone from rival gangs to civilians to cops thinks twice. And that's why if the cartel doesn't want you dead but wants to keep you in line, it'll be your family that gets the worst of it. Your partner or kids might be spirited away to an undisclosed location where they'll be beaten, starved, and held until you comply. Want them back in one piece? Well then you better play ball. This is also how cartels extract ransom. One man, known only as Felix, was snatched and ransomed by Los Zetas. More on them later. He was kidnapped by a corrupt cop and left in the hands of the cartel. Felix was tormented for 2 months while his captors called his impoverished family, threatening to murder him unless they paid. But compared to our next victims, Felix was one lucky guy. Number 9. There's a high turnover rate for cops in cities where cartels are fighting it out, like Ciudad Juarez. Refuse narco blood money and you get a target on your back. Gangs love to make an example of people who don't fall in line. But if you decide to play it dirty and take a paycheck from one of the cartels, well then there's a target on your head from all the rivals. Either way, you're probably in for a particularly nasty time. We don't know which of these categories Jose Everardo Sanchez Valenzuela fell into, but we do know that the young police officer experienced one of the worst tortures imaginable back in 2011. Jose was only in the force for a year when a gang of sicarios representing an unknown cartel surrounded him and dragged him off the street. The next time anyone saw Jose, he was being dragged out of a vehicle, his hands and feet bound together, and a plastic bag pulled over his head. By this point, he was likely either drugged or beaten into submission, but the worst was yet to come. In full view of a number of terrified onlookers in the streets of Paseos del Alba, the gang members doused Jose in an accelerant, and then a match was lit. The torturous death was drawn out, and his body was unrecognizable. The killers left a note on the scene next to the body, but the contents of that note hasn't been released to the public. But as torture of law enforcement by the cartels go, Jose's was a walk in the park compared to what happened in our next brutal entry. Number 8. What happened to Enrique Kiki Camarena is one of the most famous cases of Mexican cartel violence in all of history. And it's one that haunts the American Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, to this day. Kiki made a lot of enemies in the drug trade, acting as a valuable informant who gave the location of several major cartel growing operations to the DEA and Mexican Federales. This resulted in a lot of controlled burns and a lot of very unhappy drug kingpins back in the early 1980s. And in 1985, this came to a head for Kiki in the most brutal way imaginable. As revenge for the destruction of an extremely lucrative marijuana growing ranch the previous year, Kiki was kidnapped outside the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara by a corrupt Mexican official. He was moved to a more private location where his protracted torture could begin. According to the official DEA report, Kiki was tortured for over 30 hours. His captors broke his body and subjected him to relentless, agonizing pain. Kiki's body, along with that of his personal pilot, who was also kidnapped at the same time, would be found abandoned, wrapped in plastic. In addition to being downright disturbing in its own right, the macabre torture and death of Kiki has also been a hotbed of conspiracy in the decades to come. The CIA was in possession of several of the recorded tapes of Kiki's interrogation and murder, and for a long time refused to release them all. Given that this whole situation was very much the business of the DEA, people started to speculate that some embedded CIA asset might have been present during the whole affair. Which isn't out of the realm of possibility, given that the CIA were the ones who trained the very corrupt agents who kidnapped Kiki in the first place. The CIA, if it was really involved, really didn't want to lose face. Hey, speaking of losing face, number 7. A form of torture that is relatively unique to Mexican drug cartels in the modern world is flaying, especially when the victim is still alive. Victims are duct-taped to a chair and held in place while a sicario slowly and carefully cuts them with a razor blade. If they want you to really contemplate your life choices that led to this moment, they might just put a mirror in front of you while it's happening so you can watch. Sometimes they'll inject you with a little adrenaline so you don't go all limp on them before the fun's over. And if you really upset them, they might cut off your genitals before you bleed to death. In one infamous incident back in 2010, a man's skin was sewn onto a soccer ball and left next to City Hall. It's an extremely versatile crime against human dignity. Pruning your enemies like an unruly hedge is a pretty classic tactic for cartel torturers. Remember Felix from earlier, the guy who was kidnapped and ransomed by the Zetas? When he got out, he described similar things happening in the dingy safe houses that he was being held in. The Zetas sicarios who were holding him would regularly drag in members of the Gulf Cartel to torture for information. Felix described that the Zetas would cut a new part of them off each day until they finally gave up the goods. And when they gave up the information, they got released from the mortal coil. The Zetas took them up to a nearby mountainside and burned them down to ashes. But when it comes to cutting, we're afraid the cartels of Mexico actually need to take a back seat to the operators down in Colombia. Number 6. This next torture method comes courtesy of some Colombian drug runners during La Violencia. La Violencia was a particularly brutal decade in Colombia's history. From 1948 to 1958, a civil war between the conservative and liberal parties killed around 200,000 people, 1 in 50 Colombians. In a country where political violence had become normal, it wasn't hard for criminal organizations to claim their own slice of the pie, emphasis on slice. Probably the most well-known form of violence born out of this period was the Colombian necktie. Gangs would slash the victim's throat, and the tongue would be pulled out of the hole so it flops down onto their chest like a fleshy necktie. But that's honestly nothing compared to the horrors of the vase of flowers cut, something that would even feel graphic and tasteless in a sleazy 80s slasher movie. In this method, the gangs would dismember their victims. Then, channeling their inner florist, they arranged what was left into something resembling a grotesque human bouquet. It was a gift no one would want to receive. You won't find many tortures more horrifying than that, well, unless you wandered onto a certain ranch in rural Mexico. Number 5. It's important to remember that like all global criminal organizations throughout history, cartels are a family business. And that's proven to be extremely true with the sons of the infamous Sinaloa cartel kingpin, El Chapo. More on him and some of the disturbing methods of torture that he's pioneered later. El Chapo's sons, better known as Los Chapitos, spent years in a bloody power struggle with his old partner El Mayo for control of the Sinaloa cartel, and they proved that they were their father's son. For proof of that, you need look no further than the Navolato Ranch that served as a twisted playground for acting out their sadistic desires on rival gangsters and unlucky innocents. One of the methods that's favored by these sociopathic sons of the Sinaloa involved corkscrews. They've been known to twist them directly into the muscles of their victims before ripping them back out, the twisted metal bringing back fleshy souvenirs with it. But they've also favored a few classics that wouldn't look out of place in the US: waterboarding, electric shocks, and good old-fashioned beatings within an inch of one's life. One particularly nasty little twist is that they sometimes went a step further than just rubbing salt in their wounds. They would literally rub chili peppers into the exposed flesh of the people they were torturing. And of course, the ranch's most infamous horror involved Los Chapitos' pets, a menagerie of tigers that they were known to feed their still-living victims to, straight out of an R-rated Bond film. But while Los Chapitos have undeniably made an extremely disturbing hobby out of torture, they really don't seem that bad compared to a true professional at work. Number 4. Antonio Jaguar Marufo is a cartel hitman with a long record of brutal sadistic acts. Many of his methods were the cartel reliables: dismemberment, flaying, burning, electric shocks, stabbing, and shootings. But what made him terrifying was not the acts themselves, but the cold, clinical precision with which he carried them out. A former cartel member turned informant said the Jaguar kept a special room in one of his properties, built to make murder as clean and efficient as possible. He described the room as looking almost like something you would see in a hospital. There were clean white tiles and floors that slanted down into a drainage system in the ground, to catch spillage from anyone he and his boys happened to be working with at the time. You might think torture in a sterile clinical room is better than having your face carved off in a filthy Zetas safe house, but that kind of professionalism only shows a comfort with cruelty far beyond your average coked-up junior sicario. They have experience here, and they likely know how to hurt you in ways you can't even imagine, or at least you wouldn't want to imagine. But you know that even a notorious hitman won't employ methods of torture that are quite as brutal as the monster who hired him. Speaking of, number 3. The acts of Los Chapitos earlier were pretty bad, to put it mildly, but we don't think that they'd be where they are if they didn't pick up some pointers from dear old dad, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman himself, who probably gets the dubious honor of being the most infamous drug lord since Pablo Escobar, the Colombian king of cocaine. And Guzman sets himself apart from a lot of drug lords with his eagerness to get his hands extremely dirty. One of El Chapo's bodyguards told some insanely disturbing stories under oath about the terrible things he had seen his boss do. There was one incident where they had captured 2 former members of the Sinaloa cartel defected to greener pastures. El Chapo decided that the men needed to be taught a lesson. He would beat them relentlessly. The bodyguard said, quote, "They were completely like rag dolls. The men were broken. They could not move. But the ordeal still wasn't over. El Chapo taunted them, cursing them while he loaded his rifle. Then, in a rare show of mercy, he shot them dead. His loyal goons would then dispose of the bodies. And even that feels merciful compared to the last hours of a man from the Arellano Felix cartel. El Chapo tortured him for days on end. He was attacked continuously. No respite, no clemency. It was brutal. The man's shirt clung to him, soaked with blood, sweat, and grime. The victim was kept in a little wooden shack alone in the dark, baking in the blistering Mexican heat. Eventually, after days of suffering, El Chapo dragged him to a desolate patch of land and killed him, the body tossed into a shallow grave. El Chapo, a veritable expert on torture, described his solitary confinement in the lead-up to his American trial as torture 24 hours a day, before adding, "I cannot concentrate to help my defense. I suffer from headaches. I vomit almost every day. I have not seen the sun or breathed fresh air for 13 months in your country." But just in case that tragic little story makes you feel a little too sympathetic for El Chapo, our next terrible tale of torture will give you a good reminder of who he really is. Number 2. If all those previous descriptions of torture and death didn't clue you in, El Chapo is kind of a petty and sadistic guy. In 2004, he ordered the death of rival leader Rodolfo Carrillo's brother, all for refusing a handshake. But what happened to Rodolfo is kid stuff compared to what happened with Israel Rincon, another rival narco. His torturous demise is something that not even a horror movie director could come up with. El Chapo had Rincon at one of his properties, tied up and tortured in a secluded room with beatings, waterboarding, electrocutions in his ears, teeth getting yanked out with pliers. After hours of this torture, Rincon was starting to fall unconscious, slumping limply in his chair. That simply wouldn't do. El Chapo called in a private doctor to patch Rincon back up and return him to consciousness. And when the unfortunate narco was dragged back into the land of the living, El Chapo and his men just continued torturing him, before eventually beating and battering the poor man to death. This entire thing was being filmed and was uploaded to YouTube. The terrible torture of Israel Rincon likely traumatizing thousands of others who were unlucky enough to see it. However, while everything we have discussed today is enough to give you nightmares, we're gonna need to invite the Zetas back in one more time. Number 1. Today, Los Zetas are fractured and fading, but at their peak, they were the most brutal cartel in Mexico. They were one of the smaller cartels, originally working as a paramilitary force for defending the operations of the Gulf Cartel. But they eventually splintered off to go their own way, using everything they had learned. But because they were smaller, their violence needed to be bigger, crueler, and more audacious. They did things that seemed unimaginable, even to the other cartels. And nothing better illustrates that than the monstrous gladiator battles that the Zetas called "Who Wants to Be the Next Hitman?" These twisted torture games came into play during larger massacres such as their ransacking of migrant buses. The women would be abused and killed, but the men would be given crude melee weapons and forced to fight each other to the death. And if you manage to survive that bloody ordeal, killing people who might be your friends or even your family, you will be broken enough to be inducted into the group as a professional killer. Because what could be a worse torture than the one that turns you into a monster too? Cartel tortures can be worse than death, but sometimes their victims fight back. Watch Times Cartels Messed with the Wrong People to see what happens when the tables turn, or click on this video instead.